My mother looked me straight in the eye at my sister's wedding reception and said, "You know what would make this day perfect? If you just disappeared and never came back." 3 hours later, I walked out with their family trust fund, their business connections, and their golden child's new husband. I'm Natalie, and this is the story of how I turned their cruelest words into the most liberating moment of my life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. If this resonated, don't miss out on subscribing because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will completely change how you think about this topic. Let me take you back to where this all began because understanding the Hartwell family dynamics is crucial to appreciating just how satisfying this revenge became. I grew up in Willowbrook, an affluent suburb outside of Phoenix, where image was everything, and my family had perfected the art of maintaining appearances. My father, Jonathan Hartwell, was a successful commercial real estate developer who had built his empire from a single strip mall into a multi-million-dollar portfolio spanning 3 states. My mother, Camille, was the quintessential trophy wife who had transformed herself from a small-town secretary into the president of the Willowbrook Country Club Women's Auxiliary. Together, they had created what appeared to be the perfect American success story. Then there was my sister Autumn, 18 months younger than me, who seemed to have been born specifically to fulfill every single one of our parents' dreams. Autumn was everything they wanted in a daughter. Blonde where I was brunette, bubbly where I was serious, compliant where I was questioning. She had inherited our mother's pageant queen smile and our father's natural charm, creating this perfect storm of likability that made everyone instantly gravitate toward her. Me? I was the complication they never quite figured out how to handle. While Autumn was winning homecoming queen and dating the quarterback, I was graduating valedictorian and getting accepted to Stanford with a full academic scholarship. While she was majoring in communications and joining every sorority possible, I was double majoring in finance and computer science, graduating summa cum laude and landing a coveted position at Goldman Sachs straight out of college. You'd think these accomplishments would make any parent proud, right? Wrong. My success was always somehow inconvenient to their narrative. The dynamic became crystal clear during my college years. Every holiday break, every family gathering, every social event followed the same exhausting pattern. Autumn's mediocre achievements were celebrated like Nobel Prize wins, while my actual achievements were either downplayed or somehow twisted into problems. When I made the dean's list every semester, the conversation always shifted to how Autumn was finding herself and building character through her social activities. When I got promoted to vice president at Goldman Sachs at 26, making more money than both my parents combined, the family discussion focused on how Autumn had finally found her passion in event planning, and wasn't it wonderful that she was doing something creative? The disparity became even more obvious when it came to financial support. Autumn's college tuition, sorority fees, study abroad programs, and post-graduation finding herself phase were all bankrolled without question. When I asked for help with my Stanford application fees, I was told it would be good for me to learn the value of money by working for it myself. But here's the thing about being the overlooked child in a wealthy family. You develop certain skills out of necessity. You become observant. You learn to be self-reliant. You pay attention to details that other people miss. And most importantly, you become very, very good at understanding how money and power actually work. While Autumn was posting Instagram photos from her European backpacking adventure funded by Dad's credit card, I was quietly building my own investment portfolio. While she was moving back home after college because she needed time to figure things out, I was purchasing my first rental property in downtown Phoenix. While she was dating a series of trust fund babies who treated her like an accessory, I was networking with some of the most influential people in finance and technology. The family dynamic reached a new level of dysfunction when Autumn got engaged to Preston Whitmore III. Yes, that's his actual name, complete with the Roman numeral. Preston was everything my parents had ever dreamed of in a son-in-law. Old money, country club pedigree, connections to all the right families, and absolutely no ambition whatsoever. Preston's family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Southwest, which meant he would never have to work a real day in his life. He was handsome in that generic polo shirt and khakis way that screams peaked in prep school, and he had the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. The engagement was announced at the country club's annual charity gala, because of course it was. I watched from across the room as my parents practically glowed with pride, accepting congratulations from their social circle like they had personally orchestrated this union. The way they talked about it, you'd think Autumn had just secured world peace instead of agreeing to marry someone whose greatest accomplishment was finishing third in a college tennis tournament. But what really got to me wasn't the engagement itself. It was the immediate shift in how I was treated within the family structure. Suddenly, every conversation revolved around wedding planning. Every family dinner became a strategy session for guest lists and venue selections. Every holiday gathering turned into a showcase for Autumn's ring and Preston's family connections.
I went from being the overlooked daughter to being actively invisible. The wedding planning process revealed just how little I actually mattered to my family. Despite having more event planning experience than anyone else in the family through my work organizing corporate functions and charity galas, my input was never requested. Despite having the best understanding of our family's finances, I wasn't consulted on budget decisions. Despite having extensive connections in the hospitality and entertainment industries, my network was never tapped. Instead, I became the family ATM. When the wedding budget ballooned beyond what Dad was comfortable spending, somehow I was expected to contribute. When Autumn wanted upgrades that weren't in the original plan, I was asked to help cover the difference. When Preston's family suggested expensive additions to accommodate their guest list, I was the one who received the subtle hints about family obligations and supporting my sister's happiness. The irony was suffocating. I was successful enough to be expected to bankroll their dream wedding, but not important enough to have any say in the planning. I was family enough to be obligated to contribute financially, but not family enough to be included in the decisions about how that money would be spent. But I played along, because I still believed that family meant something. I still thought that maybe, just maybe, if I was supportive enough and generous enough and selfless enough, I would finally earn my place at their table. I was about to learn just how wrong I was. Looking back now, there were signs that should have prepared me for what was coming. Little comments here and there that revealed how my parents really felt about my place in their perfect family picture. Like when my mother mentioned that they were having professional wedding photos taken and asked if I could try to blend into the background during the family shots because my presence might distract from Autumn's special day. Or when my father suggested that maybe I shouldn't bring a date to the wedding because it might complicate the seating arrangements and draw attention away from the happy couple. Or when Autumn herself asked if I could tone down my outfit choices for the wedding events because she didn't want anyone to be distracted by trying to figure out who the overdressed woman was. This from someone whose engagement party featured a dress that cost more than most people's cars. Each comment was delivered with a smile, cushioned in language about family harmony and making sure Autumn's day was perfect. But underneath the polite words was a clear message. I was a problem that needed to be managed, not a daughter and sister who deserved to be celebrated. The most telling moment came during the rehearsal dinner, when Preston's father was giving a toast about family and tradition. He mentioned how wonderful it was that Preston was marrying into such a close-knit, harmonious family, and how he looked forward to Autumn fitting seamlessly into the Whitmore legacy. Then he raised his glass to the beautiful Hartwell family and gestured specifically to my parents and Autumn. I was standing right there, literally 3 feet away from them, and he looked right through me like I didn't exist. And my parents? They beamed with pride and didn't even glance in my direction. That's when I realized that I had been fooling myself for years. I wasn't the overlooked daughter who would eventually earn her place. I wasn't the black sheep who would someday be welcomed back into the fold. I was the family embarrassment they tolerated out of obligation and convenience. But I had no idea just how far they were willing to go to make that point clear. The real revelation was still 24 hours away, waiting for me at the wedding reception with words that would change everything. Forever. If you're loving what you're hearing, smash that subscribe button. It really keeps us going. All right, let's jump back in. What started as subtle exclusion during the engagement quickly escalated into full-scale marginalization once the actual wedding planning began. The Hartwell family had decided this would be the social event of the season in Willowbrook, and nothing was going to stand in the way of their perfect vision, especially not me. The first major incident happened during the venue selection process. Autumn had fallen in love with the Grand Meridian Estate, a historic mansion that hosted maybe 6 weddings per year and had a waiting list longer than most people's arms. The venue cost was astronomical, nearly $80,000 just for the space rental, not including catering, flowers, or any of the other wedding essentials. During the family meeting to discuss the budget, Dad looked directly at me and said, "Natalie, since you've been so successful in your career, we were hoping you might want to contribute to making your sister's dreams come true. Maybe cover the venue cost as your wedding gift." I sat there processing this request. They wanted me to pay $80,000 for a venue I had no say in choosing, for a wedding where I was already being treated like an unwanted guest. But I said yes, because I still believed that generosity might finally earn me a seat at the family table. That was my first mistake. 2 weeks later, Autumn announced her bridal party selections at another family dinner. She had chosen 8 bridesmaids, sorority sisters, childhood friends, even Preston's cousin, whom she'd met exactly twice. I listened to her excitedly describe each girl and why she was so special, waiting for my name to be mentioned.
It never was. When the dinner ended and I was helping clear dishes, I finally asked, "Autumn, I noticed you didn't mention me for the bridal party. I assumed you'd want your sister as your maid of honor." She looked genuinely surprised, like the thought had never occurred to her. "Oh, Natalie, I didn't think you'd be interested in all that bridesmaid stuff. You're so busy with your career and everything. Plus, my friend Tiffany has been planning to be my maid of honor since we were in college." My mother chimed in from across the kitchen. "Besides, honey, you know how you get at big social events. Sometimes you can be a bit intense. Autumn wants her wedding day to be light and fun." Intense. That was their code word for whenever I had opinions, asked questions, or demonstrated any kind of backbone. I was intense when I negotiated better terms for the catering contract they were getting ripped off on. I was intense when I suggested they might want to read the fine print on the photographer's contract before signing it. I was intense whenever I treated this like the major financial investment it was, instead of just mindlessly agreeing with everything. "Of course," I said, "I understand completely." But I didn't understand. I understood that I was good enough to write checks, but not good enough to stand beside my sister on the most important day of her life. The pattern continued with the guest list. Despite the fact that I had lived in Willowbrook my entire life and had extensive professional and social connections throughout Phoenix, my input on invitations was completely ignored. Meanwhile, Preston's family was adding people left and right, expanding the guest count from 200 to nearly 400. The breaking point came when I discovered that my colleagues and friends weren't just not invited, they were actively excluded. I found out by accident when my friend Rachel, a successful attorney I'd known since high school, mentioned that she'd heard about Autumn's wedding through mutual acquaintances and was surprised not to receive an invitation. When I brought this up with my parents, Dad's response was telling. "Natalie, this wedding is about celebrating Autumn and Preston's union with the people who matter most to them. Your work friends, well, they don't really fit the vibe we're going for."
The vibe they were going for, apparently, was people who don't know how successful Natalie actually is. I realized they were deliberately curating a guest list that would minimize my presence and importance. They wanted an audience that would see Autumn as the accomplished daughter and me as, what, the maiden aunt who helped pay for things? As the wedding expenses continued to spiral upward, I found myself being treated more and more like a personal ATM and less like a family member. Every upgrade, every addition, every cost overrun somehow became my responsibility to solve. When Autumn decided she needed a second dress for the reception, I was asked to cover the $12,000 cost. When Preston's family wanted to upgrade the bar package to include top-shelf liquor, I was expected to handle the $8,000 difference. When the flower bill ballooned because Autumn fell in love with out-of-season peonies that had to be flown in from New Zealand, somehow that became my problem too. Each request was presented as an opportunity for me to show how much I loved my sister. Each payment was positioned as my chance to be part of making her day special. But each time I wrote a check, I became more invisible in the actual planning process. I was paying for a wedding I had no voice in for a sister who didn't want me in her bridal party, organized by parents who treated me like a convenient bank account with legs. The most insulting incident happened just 3 weeks before the wedding, during the final dress fitting appointment. I had purchased a beautiful navy blue gown, elegant, appropriate, expensive. I felt confident and pretty, and for a brief moment I thought maybe I could actually enjoy this wedding despite everything that had happened. That feeling lasted exactly until my mother saw me in the dress. "Oh, honey, no," she said immediately. "That's far too attention-grabbing. You can't wear something that's striking to Autumn's wedding." "Mom, it's navy blue. It's perfectly appropriate for a wedding." "It's not about appropriate, Natalie. It's about knowing your place. This day is about Autumn, and that dress is going to have people asking who you are and what you do. We can't have the focus shifting away from the bride." Autumn, meanwhile, was getting fitted for a $15,000 reception dress that was literally covered in crystals and had a train longer than most people's cars. But my elegant navy blue gown was too attention-grabbing. "What exactly are you suggesting I wear?" I asked. "Something more subdued, maybe beige or gray, something that says supportive family member rather than look at me." They wanted me to dress like wallpaper at my own sister's wedding. The final insult before the wedding came when I saw the seating chart. Despite contributing nearly $200,000 to this wedding by that point, I was seated at table 12, in the back corner of the reception hall, with distant cousins I'd met maybe twice in my life. Meanwhile, Preston's college roommate, whom my family had never met before the engagement party, was seated at table 3, just 2 tables away from the bridal party. When I questioned this arrangement, my father's explanation was brutal in its honesty. "Natalie, we put you somewhere where you'll be comfortable. Table 12 has some lovely people, and you won't feel pressured to make conversation with Preston's family or our business associates.
We put you where you can't embarrass us or accidentally remind people that you're more successful than your golden child sister." The final pre-wedding humiliation was discovering that while I hadn't been invited to Autumn's bachelorette party in Napa Valley, I was expected to help pay for it. The cost breakdown I received showed expenses totaling $18,000 for the weekend. Private villa, personal chef, wine tours, spa treatments, the works. "Since you couldn't make it anyway because of your work schedule," my mother explained, "we thought you might want to contribute to making sure Autumn has the best possible time with her closest friends." The fact that my work schedule was only an issue because no one had bothered to tell me about the party dates until after they were booked was apparently irrelevant. I was close enough to be expected to fund their luxury weekend, but not close enough to be invited to participate in it. By this point, I was starting to understand that my relationship with my family wasn't just troubled or complicated. It was fundamentally transactional.
I was valuable to them only insofar as I could provide financial support and social credibility when needed, but invisible when it came to actual inclusion, affection, or respect. Every interaction had become a calculation. What could they get from me, and how could they minimize any inconvenience my presence might cause to their perfect family narrative? I was funding a wedding celebration of a family that didn't actually want me in it. But I wasn't still prepared for just how far they were willing to go to make that point clear. The real devastation was still waiting for me at the reception, where they would finally say out loud what their actions had been communicating all along. I thought I understood how little I meant to them. I was wrong. The morning of Autumn's wedding dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect Arizona days that made the desert look like paradise. The Grand Meridian estate was transformed into something out of a fairy tale, with thousands of white roses, crystal chandeliers hanging from ancient oak trees, and enough luxury to make even the Whitmore family impressed. I arrived early to help with last-minute coordination, wearing the beige dress my mother had essentially forced me to buy. It was elegant enough to be appropriate for a formal wedding, but so neutral and understated that I looked like expensive wallpaper, which I was beginning to understand was exactly the point. The morning preparations went smoothly, though I noticed I was systematically excluded from every photo opportunity. When the photographer gathered the family for pre-ceremony shots, I was repeatedly asked to step aside so they could capture intimate family moments. When Autumn was getting ready with her bridesmaids, I wasn't invited into the bridal suite despite having funded a significant portion of the day they were all enjoying. I spent most of the morning handling logistics, coordinating with vendors, managing timeline issues, solving small crises that arose. I was useful, efficient, and invisible, the perfect supporting player in someone else's story. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, I have to admit. Autumn looked radiant in her $20,000 gown, and Preston seemed genuinely happy. For a brief moment, watching them exchange vows under the flower-covered archway, I felt a flicker of joy for my sister. Whatever our family dynamics, she deserved to be happy on her wedding day. But even during the ceremony, my isolation was carefully orchestrated. While other family members were seated in the front rows, I found myself placed behind Preston's distant relatives and business associates. When the photographer captured family moments during the ceremony, I was positioned just outside the frame or asked to move so the lighting would be better for the immediate family. The most telling moment came during the ring exchange when the officiant spoke about the joining of two families. Preston's parents beamed in the front row, my parents looked radiant with pride, and I sat in the back realizing that in all the talk about family unity and new beginnings, no one had ever considered that I might want to feel included in this moment too. The cocktail hour started beautifully. The venue looked stunning, the food was exceptional, and the guests seemed genuinely impressed by the elegance of the entire event. I spent the hour making polite conversation with distant relatives and Preston's family friends, most of whom had no idea who I was or why I was there. The few people who did recognize me from previous family events seemed confused by my marginal role in the proceedings. I lost count of how many times I heard, "Oh, you're Autumn's sister. I was wondering why I hadn't seen you in any of the family photos." Or, "Aren't you supposed to be in the bridal party?" Each conversation was a small reminder of how thoroughly I'd been erased from the celebration. I was present, but not included, visible, but not acknowledged, important enough to fund, but not important enough to feature. The first real warning sign came during the cocktail hour when I overheard my mother talking to Mrs. Whitmore about family dynamics. We're so blessed that Autumn has always been such an easy daughter. No drama, no complications, just pure joy. Sometimes families have challenging members, but Autumn has always been our little ray of sunshine. I was standing less than 10 feet away, well within earshot, and it was clear that I was the challenging member she was referring to. The casual cruelty of discussing my shortcomings with Preston's mother at my sister's wedding while I was paying for the event was breathtaking in its audacity.
When dinner was served, I made my way to table 12, tucked away in the far corner of the reception hall.
My table mates were lovely people, distant cousins, family friends from my parents' early years, older relatives who rarely attended family gatherings. But the placement was clearly strategic. Surround Natalie with people who don't know enough about her success to ask uncomfortable questions or draw attention to the family's treatment of her. Throughout dinner, I watched my parents work the room like the social politicians they'd become. They moved from table to table, charming Preston's family, networking with business associates, basking in the glow of having thrown the social event of the season. They were in their element, and autumn was the perfect centerpiece for their performance. I noticed that they never once stopped by table 12. Not to check on me, not to introduce me to anyone, not even to acknowledge my presence. I had become a ghost at my own sister's wedding. The most painful moment came during dinner when Preston's father stood up to give an impromptu toast about family. He spoke about the importance of strong family bonds, about how impressed he was with the Hartwell family's closeness and values, about how lucky Preston was to be marrying into such a wonderful, tight-knit clan. As he spoke, he gestured toward my parents and Autumn, clearly identifying them as the family he was praising. The spotlight followed his gestures, illuminating their proud faces and completely bypassing my corner table. To anyone watching, it would appear that these three people were the entire Hartwell family worth mentioning. I sat in the shadows, literally and figuratively, invisible, while hundreds of guests applauded a vision of my family that had no place for me in it. After dinner, I decided I needed to address what was happening. I couldn't continue sitting silently while my own family treated me like an unwelcome stranger at an event I'd largely funded. During a quiet moment when my parents were standing together near the bar, I approached them. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked quietly. My father looked annoyed, as if I was interrupting something important. "Natalie, this isn't really the time for family discussions. This is Autumn's night." "That's exactly what I want to talk about," I said. "I've contributed over $200,000 to this wedding, and I feel like I'm being treated like an unwanted guest. I'm not in any family photos. I wasn't included in the bridal party. I'm seated with people I barely know, and I haven't had a single meaningful conversation with either of you all day." My mother's expression shifted to that particular look of strained patience she'd perfected over the years. "Natalie, everything isn't always about you. This is your sister's wedding day. Could you please just try to be supportive without making it complicated?" "I'm not trying to make it complicated. I'm trying to understand why I feel like a stranger at my own sister's wedding. I love Autumn, and I want to celebrate her, but I also want to feel like I belong here." My father stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You do belong here, Natalie, your family, but you have to understand that sometimes family means knowing when to step back and let others shine. This day is about Autumn and Preston, not about your feelings." "I'm not asking to be the center of attention. I'm asking to be included, to be acknowledged, to be treated like the daughter and sister I am, instead of like a convenient donor who should be grateful for an invitation." The look that passed between my parents in that moment was one I'd seen countless times before, but never understood until now. It was the look of people who were tired of managing a problem they'd never wanted to deal with in the first place. My mother glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration or even disappointment. It was something much worse. Complete indifference mixed with barely contained irritation. "Natalie, do you want to know what would actually make this day perfect?" I nodded, thinking she was about to suggest some way we could fix this, some compromise that would help me feel more included. "If you just disappeared and never came back." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward as if I could somehow distance myself from what I just heard. "What?" I whispered. My father didn't contradict her. He didn't look shocked or appalled or rush to clarify that she didn't mean it. He just stood there, nodding slightly as if she'd finally said what they'd both been thinking for years. "You heard me," my mother continued, her voice still low but absolutely steady. "You've always been the complication in this family, the one who doesn't fit, the one who makes everything more difficult than it needs to be. Autumn's wedding is perfect, except for one thing. You're here, making everyone uncomfortable with your resentment and your demands for attention." I stood there completely speechless. As the noise of the reception continued around us, guests were laughing, music was playing, people were celebrating my sister's happiness, and my mother was telling me that my complete absence from their lives would be the greatest gift I could give. "Mom," I started, but she cut me off.
We've tried, Natalie. We've really tried to find a place for you in this family, but you just don't fit. You're too intense, too demanding, too different from who we are. Autumn gets it. She understands what family means, but you, she paused, looking me up and down like I was a puzzle she'd given up trying to solve. You've never understood that being family means sometimes sacrificing your own ego for the greater good. My father finally spoke, and his words were somehow even more devastating than my mother's, because they were delivered with such matter-of-fact calmness. "The truth is, Natalie, you've been making family gatherings uncomfortable for years. People don't know how to talk to you. They feel judged by your success, intimidated by your intensity. Even tonight, you're more focused on your own feelings than on celebrating your sister." "I funded this entire wedding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And we're grateful for that," my mother said. "But money doesn't give you the right to disrupt Autumn's happiness. If you really loved your sister, you'd want her to have a perfect day without having to worry about managing your emotions." The cruelty of that statement was breathtaking. I had spent months swallowing my hurt, writing checks without complaint, and trying to be the supportive sister and daughter they claimed to want. And now they were telling me that my very presence was a burden they'd been heroically enduring. "So what are you saying exactly?" I asked. My parents exchanged another look, and I could see them making a decision in real time. "We're saying that maybe it's time for you to build your own life, away from us, away from the constant tension and complications, away from trying to force yourself into a family where you've never quite belonged." My mother nodded. "Think about it, Natalie. Haven't you always felt like an outsider here? Haven't you always felt like we don't understand you? Maybe that's because you don't actually belong with us. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you just moved on." I stood there, in my beige dress, in the corner of the reception hall I'd paid for, listening to my parents tell me that the family I'd spent my entire life trying to please would be happier without me in it. The worst part wasn't the cruelty of their words. The worst part was the relief I could see in their faces as they finally said what they'd apparently been thinking for years. They didn't want me to change or try harder or be different. They wanted me to disappear. And for the first time in my life, I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I stood there for exactly 30 seconds after my parents delivered their devastating verdict, watching them return to the reception as if they hadn't just told their daughter to disappear forever. The sounds of celebration continued around me. Laughter, clinking glasses, the band playing romantic songs for couples swaying on the dance floor. Life was moving forward, while mine had just been shattered. But here's the thing about being told you don't belong.
sometimes it's the most liberating thing anyone can say to you, because suddenly all the rules change, all the obligations disappear, all the guilt about putting family first evaporates completely. They wanted me to disappear. Perfect. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for, but not in any way they could have anticipated. I walked calmly to the ladies' room, locked myself in a stall, and pulled out my phone. Not to cry or call a friend for support, but to start making a very specific list. Because when you've spent years in high-level finance, you develop certain skills. You learn to compartmentalize emotion and focus on strategy. You understand leverage, timing, and most importantly, you know how to identify someone's vulnerabilities and use them strategically. My family had just made the biggest tactical error of their lives. They dismissed someone who knew exactly where all their weaknesses were hidden. While my family had been treating me like an unwelcome outsider, I'd been quietly absorbing information about their lives, finances, and secrets for years. Being ignored has certain advantages. People tend to speak freely around you, assuming you're not paying attention or that your opinion doesn't matter. I knew, for instance, that my father's real estate empire wasn't quite as solid as it appeared. He'd been leveraging properties to fund new acquisitions, creating a house of cards that looked impressive, but was vulnerable to any significant market shift. I'd seen the financial statements during family business discussions, noticed the concerning debt-to-equity ratios, and observed his increasing stress about interest rate changes. I knew that my mother's social standing was built entirely on appearances that required constant maintenance. Her position as president of the Women's Auxiliary was actually quite precarious. There were 3 other women who'd been vying for her position and would love any excuse to challenge her leadership. Her charity work, while publicly praised, was largely performative and funded by Dad's business success. I knew that Autumn had no actual job skills or financial independence whatsoever. Despite being 26 years old, she'd never held a real job, had no marketable skills, and was entirely dependent on family money for her lifestyle. Even her engagement to Preston was essentially a financial transaction disguised as romance. Most importantly, I knew that Preston's family, despite their old money pretensions, was facing serious financial difficulties. The luxury car dealership business had been struggling for years due to changing consumer preferences and online sales disrupting their traditional model. They needed this marriage alliance more than they were letting on.
But the most crucial piece of information I possessed was something my family had completely forgotten. I was a co-signer on several of Dad's business loans and a listed beneficiary on multiple family financial accounts. When I'd turned 18, Dad had added me to various financial instruments for tax purposes and estate planning. When I'd started making significant money, he'd asked me to co-sign on expansion loans to improve his borrowing terms, all of which meant I had legal standing and financial leverage they'd completely overlooked. I spent the rest of the reception quietly observing and planning. I smiled when spoken to, made polite conversation when required, and generally played the role of the forgettable family member they'd always seen me as. But internally, I was calculating exactly how to dismantle the life they'd built while excluding me from it. Phase 1 was immediate and surgical. I excused myself early from the reception, claiming a headache, and drove straight home to my downtown Phoenix penthouse. While my family was celebrating Autumn's perfect wedding, I was in my home office making phone calls and sending emails. First, I contacted my attorney, David Richardson, who specialized in family law and business litigation. David had handled my real estate acquisitions and was familiar with my family's financial structure.
I explained the situation and asked him to immediately begin the process of removing me from all shared financial obligations with my parents. "Are you sure about this, Natalie?" he asked. "Once we start this process, it's going to be very difficult to reverse." "I'm completely sure," I replied. "They want me out of the family. I'm simply going to formalize their wish." Second, I called my financial advisor and instructed her to liquidate my position in several investments that my father had recommended and that I'd purchased based on his advice. These investments were in companies that had significant business relationships with Hartwell Development. My withdrawal would signal to the market that someone with inside knowledge was losing confidence in these ventures. Third, I sent a carefully worded email to 3 key contacts in Phoenix's commercial real estate industry. These were people I'd met through my work in finance who had previously expressed interest in development opportunities. I mentioned that there might be some interesting acquisition possibilities emerging in the Willowbrook area and that I'd be happy to discuss details with serious investors. The next morning, while my family was presumably recovering from the wedding celebration, I was implementing Phase 2. This was where my position as co-signer on Dad's business loans became crucial. I'd co-signed on a $2.8 million construction loan for Dad's latest development project, a luxury shopping complex on the outskirts of Scottsdale. The loan terms included a clause that allowed any co-signer to trigger a full financial review if they had concerns about the project's viability. This review could potentially accelerate the loan repayment schedule if certain benchmarks weren't being met. I formally requested this review, citing concerns about market conditions and project management. This wasn't malicious. I genuinely had concerns about the project based on what I'd observed. But the timing was strategically chosen to create maximum disruption when Dad was least prepared to handle it. Additionally, I exercised my right to withdraw from several shared investment accounts. This was entirely legal since I was a named account holder, but it removed approximately $400,000 in liquid assets that Dad had been counting on for operating expenses. The beauty of this approach was that I wasn't doing anything illegal or even particularly vindictive. I was simply exercising my legal rights as a financial partner who no longer wanted to be associated with family business ventures. But the financial pressure was only the beginning. I understood that for a family like mine, reputation and social standing were just as important as money. They'd built their identity around being successful, respected pillars of the Willowbrook community. That image was about to become much more difficult to maintain. I started by reaching out to contacts in Phoenix's social and business circles, not to spread gossip, but to share my professional transition. I let it be known that I was scaling back my involvement in local investments and family business ventures to focus on opportunities in other markets. This immediately raised questions. When Natalie Hartwell, known for her financial acumen, suddenly withdraws from her family's business ventures right after her sister's expensive wedding, people in the investment community notice. They start asking questions about what she might know that they don't. I also began accepting social invitations I'd previously declined due to family obligations. Charity galas, business networking events, cultural functions. All the occasions where I'd typically represented the family's interests. But now, I was attending as an independent professional, not as a Hartwell daughter. This shift was subtle but significant. Instead of reflecting credit on my family, my success was now highlighting my independence from them. The most devastating phase involved leveraging my professional relationships in ways my family had never considered possible. Remember how they deliberately excluded my colleagues and industry contacts from the wedding guest list? That decision was about to backfire spectacularly. I reached out to contacts at major financial institutions and investment firms throughout the Southwest, not to badmouth my family, but to discuss market opportunities and industry trends. In these conversations, I mentioned that I was looking at investment possibilities outside of Arizona and might be interested in relocating for the right opportunity. Within a week, word had spread through Phoenix's financial community that Natalie Hartwell was potentially leaving the market. For a commercial real estate developer like my father, having a daughter with extensive connections in investment banking was a significant competitive advantage.
Losing those connections would put him at a serious disadvantage against other developers. I also made strategic moves with the Whitmore family's financial vulnerabilities. Through my industry contacts, I learned that Preston's family was indeed in serious financial trouble. Their car dealership business was facing multiple lawsuits, and their credit lines were stretched to the breaking point. I didn't have to actively sabotage them. I simply stopped providing the financial stability they'd been counting on through their connection to my family. When business associates asked about my opinion of the Whitmore family as potential partners, I was diplomatically honest about the challenges facing their industry. The final phase was the most psychologically devastating. I simply vanished from their lives completely. No more family dinners, no more holiday celebrations, no more being available to solve financial problems or handle family crises. But this wasn't a dramatic storm out or an emotional cutting of ties. It was a professional, systematic withdrawal that left them unable to criticize my behavior or paint me as the unreasonable one. I changed my phone number and didn't give them the new one. I hired a property management company to handle my local real estate investments, so I wouldn't need to be physically present in Phoenix regularly. I informed our mutual contacts that I was transitioning away from family business involvement and should no longer be included in communications about Hartwell development projects. Most importantly, I accepted a consulting position with a major investment firm that required significant travel. This gave me a legitimate, professional reason to be unavailable for family obligations while building my independent career. What made the strategy so effective was that I never had to actively attack or sabotage my family. I simply withdrew the support, connections, and financial backing they'd been taking for granted while simultaneously excluding me from the benefits of family membership. Every action I took was professionally defensible and personally reasonable. I was protecting my financial interests, pursuing career opportunities, and establishing healthy boundaries with family members who had explicitly told me I didn't belong. The consequences they were about to experience weren't the result of my vindictiveness. They were the natural result of losing someone whose contributions they'd never properly valued. They wanted me to disappear? Perfect. They were about to learn exactly how much my presence had been worth to them, and exactly how much my absence was going to cost them. The consequences of my strategic withdrawal began manifesting within 2 weeks of Autumn's wedding. I learned about most of them through my former assistant, Monica, who had stayed in touch with contacts at my father's company. She would send me occasional updates, not out of malice, but because she was genuinely concerned about how quickly things were unraveling for the Hartwell family. The first domino to fall was Dad's construction loan review. When the bank's assessment team examined the Scottsdale shopping complex project more closely, they discovered several issues I'd suspected but hadn't directly reported. The project was behind schedule, over budget, and facing permit complications that Dad had been downplaying in his progress reports. More critically, the bank realized that with my withdrawal from the financial equation, the debt-to-equity ratio on the project no longer met their lending standards. They didn't call the loan immediately, but they did implement much stricter oversight and required additional collateral that Dad struggled to provide. Within days of that review, word spread through Phoenix's commercial real estate community that Hartwell Development was facing financial scrutiny. In an industry built on confidence and relationships, that kind of news travels fast and hits hard. The second consequence was the unraveling of Dad's professional network. For years, my connections in the financial sector had provided him with access to investors, favorable lending terms, and early information about market opportunities. When I withdrew from family business involvement, those connections disappeared with me. Potential investors who had been considering Hartwell development projects suddenly found other opportunities more appealing. Banking relationships that had been warm and accommodating became strictly professional and conservative. Business deals that had been moving forward smoothly hit unexpected roadblocks. While Dad was dealing with business pressures, Mom was facing her own crisis. The Willowbrook social scene was smaller and more interconnected than she realized, and my absence from family events was becoming conspicuous. The first major social event after the wedding was the annual Phoenix Children's Hospital Charity Gala, an occasion where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen while supporting a worthy cause. In previous years, I had attended as the successful Hartwell daughter, reflecting credit on the family's values and accomplishments. This year, I attended independently, having purchased my own table and invited colleagues from my new consulting position. When people asked about my family, I simply mentioned that I was focusing on my career transition and preferred to handle my charitable giving independently. The contrast was stark and noticed by everyone who mattered in Phoenix society. Instead of the cohesive, successful family unit they had always presented, the Hartwells now appeared fractured. Mom attended with Dad, but without the daughter whose professional success had always added credibility to their social standing.
Even worse, my independent table was filled with impressive business leaders and financial experts, making it clear that my professional network was both extensive and separate from my family's influence. The implicit message was obvious. Natalie Hartwell was successful in her own right and no longer needed family connections to access Phoenix's power circles. The whisper started immediately. Why wasn't Natalie sitting with her family? Had there been some kind of falling out? What did Natalie know about the family's financial situation that was making her distance herself? Meanwhile, the Whitmore family's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. The market pressures I'd quietly mentioned to industry contacts were compounding their existing problems. 3 major automotive manufacturers terminated their franchise agreements within a month of each other, citing concerns about the dealership chain's financial stability and customer service record. Preston, who had never worked a real job in his life, was suddenly faced with the prospect of actually having to support himself and his new wife. The trust fund that had supported his lifestyle was largely tied up in the failing family business, and his parents were scrambling to restructure their debt obligations. Autumn, who had been planning to continue her comfortable lifestyle of charity events and social functions, found herself married to someone whose financial prospects were considerably less promising than they'd appeared during the engagement. The beautiful irony was that if they'd maintained their connection to me, I could have helped them navigate these challenges. My financial expertise and industry connections could have provided solutions or at least softened the landing. Instead, they were facing these crises alone, having explicitly told me I didn't belong in their family. About 6 weeks after the wedding, the phone calls started. First from Dad, then from Mom, and finally from Autumn herself. I let every call go to voicemail and listened to each message with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Dad's first message was tentative and business-focused. Natalie, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to discuss some family financial matters and get your perspective on a few investment opportunities. Could you call me back when you have a chance? When I didn't respond, the messages became more frequent and more desperate. Mom's voicemails were masterpieces of manipulation disguised as concern. Honey, we're worried about you. The silence isn't like you. Whatever happened at the wedding, we can work through it as a family. Please call us back. Autumn's messages were the most revealing because they showed just how quickly her perfect life was falling apart. Natalie, I don't know what's going on between you and Mom and Dad, but Preston's family is having some business problems, and I thought maybe you could give us some advice. You're so good with financial stuff, and I know you care about family. The progression of their messages over several weeks painted a clear picture of mounting desperation. They were finally realizing that my contributions to their lives had been much more significant than they'd understood. While my family was struggling with the consequences of my absence, I was building the most fulfilling life I'd ever had. The consulting position with Morrison Financial Group was everything I'd hoped for professionally. I was working on high-level mergers and acquisitions across multiple industries, traveling to major cities, and collaborating with some of the brightest minds in finance. More importantly, I was finally working with people who valued my intelligence and expertise instead of seeing them as problems to be managed. My colleagues were ambitious, driven professionals who appreciated direct communication and strategic thinking. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to apologize for being successful or tone down my achievements to make other people comfortable. I'd also started dating someone I'd met through work, James Chin, a mergers and acquisitions attorney who was brilliant, ambitious, and found my independence attractive rather than threatening. James came from a family that celebrated each other's successes instead of competing for attention, and spending time with them showed me what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. The contrast between my new life and my old family situation was stark. I was happier, more confident, and more successful than I'd ever been. The family that had told me I didn't belong was struggling without me, while I was thriving without them. The breaking point came 3 months after the wedding when Dad showed up at my office unannounced. Monica tried to turn him away, but I decided it was time to have the conversation that had been building since the wedding reception. He looked older and more stressed than I'd ever seen him. The confident, successful businessman who had dismissed me at Autumn's wedding had been replaced by someone who was clearly struggling with problems beyond his ability to solve. "Natalie," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "we need to talk about this family situation." "What family situation?" I asked calmly. "You know what I'm talking about. This silent treatment, this withdrawal from family business. Whatever happened at the wedding, we need to move past it." I leaned back in my chair and studied his face. "Dad, I'm simply giving you what you asked for. You and Mom made it very clear that I don't belong in this family, so I removed myself from it." "That's not what we meant. We were stressed about the wedding. Emotions were running high. We didn't mean for you to disappear completely."
"Actually," I said, "Mom was very specific. She said the day would be perfect if I disappeared and never came back. I'm just following her suggestion." He was quiet for a long moment, clearly realizing that their exact words were being used against them. "Natalie, the family is struggling right now. The business is facing some challenges, and we could really use your expertise and connections." "I'm sure you could," I agreed, "but I'm no longer available for family business consultation. You made it clear that my involvement was unwelcome." "What would it take?" he asked desperately. "What would it take for you to come back and help us work through this?" I considered his question carefully. "An acknowledgement," I said finally. "A genuine acknowledgement of how I was treated, not just at the wedding, but for years. An apology that recognizes the damage that was done. And a commitment to treating me as an equal member of this family, not as a convenient resource to be used when needed and dismissed when inconvenient." Dad nodded eagerly. "Of course, absolutely. We can do that. But here's the thing, Dad. I don't actually want to come back. You did me a favor by telling me I didn't belong. You freed me from the obligation to keep trying to earn acceptance from people who were never going to give it to me. I'm happier now than I've ever been." 6 months after Autumn's wedding, I received a formal written apology from all 3 family members. The letters were clearly lawyer-reviewed, but seemed genuinely remorseful. They acknowledged their treatment of me had been unfair and hurtful, and they expressed regret for the pain they had caused. I appreciated the apologies, but I didn't respond to them. The time for words had passed. Instead, I sent each of them a wedding invitation. James and I had gotten engaged 2 months earlier, and we were planning a small, intimate ceremony in Napa Valley. The guest list included my closest friends, my new colleagues, and James's wonderful family who would welcome me with open arms. My family was invited, but as guests, not as central figures in my life story. They could come and celebrate with me if they chose, but my happiness no longer depended on their approval or participation. The wedding was beautiful, meaningful, and completely different from Autumn's elaborate social performance. It was about love, commitment, and building a life with someone who valued me exactly as I am. Autumn and Preston attended, though their marriage was already showing strain from financial pressures and the reality of Preston's lack of ambition. Mom and Dad came as well, looking somewhat shock-shelled by the elegant simplicity of an event that hadn't required anyone to go into debt or compromise their values. During the reception, Mom approached me privately. "Natalie, I want you to know that seeing you this happy makes me realize how wrong we were. You were never the problem in our family. You were the solution we were too proud to appreciate." It was a nice sentiment, and I told her I appreciated it. But the truth was, their approval no longer mattered to me the way it once had. I had found my own family in James and his relatives, my own success in my career, and my own happiness in a life built on my own terms. Today,
3 years later, I'm 31 years old and a partner at Morrison Financial Group. James and I have a beautiful home in Scottsdale, successful careers that complement each other, and a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. My parents eventually recovered financially, though they had to scale back significantly and approach business more conservatively. They learned to live within their means and appreciate what they had instead of constantly chasing status and appearances. Autumn and Preston divorced after 2 years of marriage. She's currently working her first real job at an art gallery and seems to be finding some independence and self-respect. Preston moved back in with his parents and is slowly learning what it means to work for a living. We maintain polite but distant contact. We exchange holiday cards and birthday greetings. If there's a family emergency, I'm available to help. But the days of me desperately seeking their approval and acceptance are over. The most satisfying part isn't that they struggled without me, though there's admittedly some poetic justice in that outcome. The most satisfying part is that I finally learned what I should have understood years ago. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to walk away from people who don't value you, even when those people are family. They wanted me to disappear, and I did. But I disappeared into a life that was infinitely better than anything I could have built while trying to earn their acceptance. And that is the most satisfying revenge of all. Living well, loving freely, and building a life where I'm celebrated instead of tolerated. Sometimes the best response to being told you don't belong isn't to fight for your place at their table. Sometimes it's to build your own table, surrounded by people who are honored to be there with you. Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.